All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Deb Hodgson. For those of you who are familiar with me, please bear with me as I repeat my story. I am co-founder for New Hampshire for Safe Technology, along with Jen White and Lori Schreier. And my unplanned journey over the past 6 years is what's led me here today. In the fall of 2017, we had scheduled to have our home measured for wireless on our return from a hiking trip out west. I had planned to come off blood thinners, and I was aware that wireless could thicken the blood, so I thought perhaps that was a prudent precaution to take. I had also been having issues with insomnia, constant ringing in the ears, heart arrhythmia, palpitations, tooth and jaw pain, dry eye, facial flushing, dizziness, and blood pressure issues. I had developed severe pressure headaches that felt like my brain was swollen or on fire. I had great difficulty thinking, speaking, and remembering. I even got lost several times in the town I've lived in for nearly 40 years. I didn't yet know that it was all related until we removed the wireless from our home and cars. My health quickly improved. My seemingly unrelated symptoms disappeared as well. Interestingly, the plant in my kitchen that sat there doing nothing for over a year suddenly grew 15 inches in just 2 months. That was an eye-opener to everyone in the family, as it's much easier to believe what you can actually see. Realizing this is an issue that ultimately affects everyone, I stepped way out of my comfort zone with a little push from reading EMF Off and with the support of Cece, despite knowing others will certainly think I must be crazy. I held 2 public screenings of Generation Zapped and reached out to many, including legislators. My state rep, Patrick Abrami, was truly exceptional. He actually listened and responded. He investigated the science and was successful, along with State Senator Tom Sherman, in getting New Hampshire to pass the first U.S. law to begin addressing technology safety. The New Hampshire Commission on Health and Environmental Effects of Wireless Technology was established in the fall of 2019 and produced a groundbreaking report in the fall of 2020. The New Hampshire Commission report is a great place to become informed, to empower you to protect yourself, your family, and community by becoming aware and learning how to use technology safely. We at New Hampshire for Safe Technology, along with Cece of Mass from Safe Technology, are supporting the Commission's work through the community information sessions like this, and we thank you for being here. Our speaker today is none other than Cece Doucette. Cece has been a tireless supporter to us in New Hampshire and all across the country, and we are grateful to her. Welcome, Cece.
Thanks so much, Deb. And, it's just incredible the work that you guys have done in New Hampshire, and we're just honored to be able to join you to help share information. So what we'll do today is I will switch over in a moment to a set of slides that we'll go through. And in the next day or two, we will send those slides your way along with the recording today so that you can go back and refresh yourself on areas that may interest you. And then feel free to dive into my slides. Wherever you see a link, you can get right to the information that interests you most. And we say, don't take our word on any of this. Get to know the science and the facts for yourself, because that's the pathway to start taking baby steps to make changes that might help you. And then eventually you might find the courage to do something for somebody else and perhaps help your own community. So with that, I will go ahead and do a screen share. And that should come up in just a second. Deb, can you confirm that you can see my slides? Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so like Deb, I had no idea I would be spending my time talking about the wireless radiation issue. And what we, when we learn this, we can't unknow it. So I'm very grateful that I was able to use my skill set. My bachelor's is in communication studies. My master's is in technical and professional writing. And so I'm fortunate that I can just get out and speak to people because it's kind of my happy place. So the way I fell down into the rabbit hole on this is that I used to run our local education foundation when my children were in schools, and the industry was pushing in their 21st century classroom. And one night at book group, a friend of mine who's an electrical engineer tipped us off that there could be biological effects from this man-made wireless radiation. I didn't pay much attention at first, and then something else crossed my desk not long after that, and it was the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. These are the doctors who get the conundrum cases that regular physicians don't have the skill set to address. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine was putting out a position statement to school superintendents saying, please don't allow wireless tech into your schools because it's harmful. So that was where I started doing my investigation. And being a tech writer, I just thought, wow, well, is there any science to this? And you will discover if you go out and look, there are literally hundreds and thousands of peer-reviewed studies all over the world showing these man-made frequencies are indeed very harmful. And we'll walk you through the science in just a few minutes. So it was not an easy conversation to have because the industry was pushing hard to get this into our schools and offering sweetheart deals to get the first tier of equipment, and everybody had fallen for it. So it was very difficult to have this conversation, but ultimately we became in 2014 the first public school district in the United States to have this little sign hanging in our classrooms with best practices for mobile devices. Turn these things off when we're not using them. Don't leave the Wi-Fi access points on. Turn the Wi-Fi on only when needed, and always place the mobile device on a solid surface. And we'll give you a walk through the legal fine print that caused our schools to take these measures. And then I went to my state senator, Karen Spilka. She and I had served together on our local education foundation, and I showed her the science, and I showed her Ashland's little sign, and I showed her the radiation coming off of her cell phone and her district director's laptop. And both of them looked at me, with wide eyes saying, really? This is harmful? And I said, yes. And nobody knows. I said, just like with alcohol, tobacco, drugs, pornography, gambling, all these addictive behaviors, people at least deserve the right to know that this also has a very heavy addiction component because the radiation hits the same receptors in the brain, in addition to a host of other problems. So Senator Spilka, who's now our Senate president, she put me in touch with an attorney in her office, and together we crafted a very simple bill that would form a commission and bring the right minds to the table at the state level, look at this issue, and decide what to do. Well, I can't tell you what happens behind closed doors in the Massachusetts legislature. We have had bills here for 10 years trying to inform and protect the public. We still have taken no meaningful steps. But as Deb noted, we worked really hard in New Hampshire, and within 7 months, we got a law passed to investigate, and they spent 1 year looking at the science, speaking with world-leading experts, and they came out with a groundbreaking report that we'll walk you through in just a few minutes. So that's how I started getting involved with this. And then I was contacted by a couple in Europe, Brett and Lynn West, and they realized that we can't fix it until people understand what the issue is. So together with those two, plus one of the leading scientists out of Finland, Dr. Mikko Ahonen, we built a little nonprofit called Wireless Education, where we have off-the-shelf, ready-to-go online training that people can complete in about a half an hour. And then it provides a handy tip sheet with reminders, as well as a certificate of completion that some companies and schools need to turn over to their human resources department to confirm that they've completed the training. So when I fell down the rabbit hole a decade ago, I didn't have anybody to speak to for the first 2 years. And now fast forward a decade, we have amazing resources, and we will give you a lot of resources you can use today to help learn, to open this conversation with others, and to start protecting your loved ones and your town. So lots of great news to share. I also co-founded Massachusetts for Safe Technology. Dr. Deborah Davis, who's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate on climate change, she figured out what the wireless issue is, and she's one of our nation's top scientists. And she brought a panel of experts to our state house here in Massachusetts and taught them what this issue is and asked for right to know legislation. And for 2 years, I was the only person I could talk to about this, and I wasn't even sure what I was saying half the time. So to then go to our state house to a standing room only forum with legislators, with scientists, with doctors, with captains of industry, it was really validating that indeed we have a major problem here. And so a lot of us got together after that and formed Massachusetts for Safe Technology. We meet once a month, and people from all over the country, even from Canada and Europe, join us from time to time to compare notes. What's working in our communities? How can we get word out? How can we start protecting our zoning bylaws and so forth? So we typically meet on the third Wednesday of every month at 12 noon Eastern, and we go through what's happening in our own communities, in our states, and what we can do towards positive change. I like to include this link. I was invited to be a co-chair of the technology panel at the Health and Buildings Roundtable Conference at the National Institutes of Health. And we think this was the first time that amongst the doctors and the hospitals and the city planners and the architects and, all the green teams out there, plus our federal agencies, this was perhaps the first time that wireless radiation was invited into the conversation. And our talks were limited to 10 minutes or less. And so I was so honored that on my panel came Dr. Martin Pall, who's one of the leading researchers on this issue. And in 10 minutes, he nails the science on biologically the mechanisms of harm. We had Theodora Scarrato, who's the executive director of Dr. Deborah Davis's Environmental Health Trust. She taught us what other countries are already doing to remove these exposures from schools and really reduce what we're being harmed by today. And we also had Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada. So we had a captain of industry on our panel. And his message is, yeah, we are not safe in North America. The US Federal Communications Guidelines do not protect us. Canada's Safety Code 6 standards do not protect us. And he said that industry can absolutely do better, but they need a nudge. And that's where you and I come in. We have to raise this from the grassroots up through our communities to the state level, up to the federal level, before we will probably see meaningful action. Also on this panel, we had a gentleman named Peter Sullivan, and Peter used to be a fighter pilot like Top Gun. So he was up way up above the earth in the very high levels of natural electromagnetic radiation. He also had radar on his planes. And by the way, that's where Wi-Fi came from. It is this radar that was built for military purposes that then got repurposed and brought into the commercial market. So he had high exposures on the outside of his plane, inside his plane with all the instrumentation panels, and his health started to crash. He went on from the military and worked in Silicon Valley as an engineer, and his friends were the folks who invented cell phones and so on. He started getting really skinny, dropping uncontrollable weight. His teeth started getting brittle. When his two sons came up through the preschool years, they were both diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And so Peter started doing the investigation. He did what a lot of parents of autistic children will do: put them on a clean organic diet, reduce the toxic load by not eating more environmental toxins. And he went so far as to do the heavy metal detoxification as well, to get the heavy metals that settle into the brain and other organs out. Today, he will tell families, do the digital detox as soon as you can. Start with 12 hours a night with no radio frequency in your homes. And what he said next really startled me, because he said that both of his sons, because they created a clean environment for his children, both of his sons are no longer on the autism spectrum. And I didn't even know that was a possibility. But apparently there's something called de novo mutations, meaning it didn't come from mom's bloodline, it didn't come from dad's bloodline. The injuries happen from somewhere in the environment. So you clean up the environment. And we see a lot of people who make just incredible inroads toward recovery by simply removing the electro pollution and other environmental stressors. So if you're looking to open this conversation with somebody who may not have a lot of time, these short talks from the National Institutes of Health might be a good opening for you there. And then one of the big areas that we had a gap was that we could tell that so many people were getting sick from this, but there was nothing out there to train our doctors, our nurses, our first responders, and other healthcare practitioners how to actually learn to recognize, diagnose, treat, and most importantly, prevent these microwave illnesses. So we use certain acronyms. EMF stands for electromagnetic fields. These are the pulsations of the radio frequency radiation or microwaves that come out of all of our wireless technology. There are other types of man-made energy fields like this. We have electric fields, we have magnetic fields, and we have dirty electricity that can seep into our living spaces from behind the wall in the wiring. So for today's talk, we're going to be focusing mostly on the man-made microwave radiation of this electromagnetic radiation. It's in the microwave segment of something called the EMF spectrum. But these terms are often used interchangeably. Just know it's this man-made radiation that we've created that is harming us today. But the great news is that we just concluded a medical conference on this in July, and Elizabeth Kelly, who is the executive director of that conference, although there's no longer continuing education credits you can apply for, she has taken all the videos, all the recordings of the experts in this conference and put them online for free. So now anybody in the world can go out to the EMF Medical Conference 2021 and take this training free of charge and learn from some of the best in the world. So just know for every problem we've created, there are solutions that we're going to share with you today, and we will do Q&A at the end of this session. So what made my schools stand up and do something? We think it was when they read the legal fine print. So for anybody who's with us today who has an iPhone, we invite you to take that out and go into your settings. And if you don't happen to have an iPhone, you'll find the same thing in your own device if you just put in the make and model and do a search on RF exposure, this radio frequency. Our friends at Environmental Health Trust also have another web page called See the Fine Print. And it will show you that, for example, in the iPad, there was a disclaimer in there that said, be careful, this can cause seizures, blackouts, eye strain. And I know personally of 2 children who had their first seizures while using the iPad. So in your settings on an iPhone, go down a little ways and hit General, go all the way down to the bottom to Legal and Regulatory and hit that. And then up next, you'll see a little list at the top, and 4 down, you'll see RF exposure. This is this radio frequency radiation that the industry politely calls energy, but it's truly two-way microwave radiation. And they tell us a couple really important things. One, this device was tested at a distance from the body. So if you're holding it in your hand, if you're tucking it in your bra or your suit or your shirt pocket, or you're putting it in your waistband or your back pocket, you are exceeding the government radiation exposure limits, which, by the way, were never biologically safety tested. So even though they have some limits, they're not safe. And we'll teach you more about that when we talk about the lawsuits that are happening right now. So when you look a little further down in that legal fine print, they say to reduce your exposure, don't touch it. It becomes kind of common sense once we know this is radiation. Don't touch it. Use a hands-free option. They suggest a speakerphone or a hollow tube headset. So when I learned about this, and I learned there were detection meters where we can make this invisible toxin visible, I went after a grant in my town here of Ashland, Massachusetts. And when I started talking to our select board about that's like our city council, they had no idea that we were in a pickle here. And so it took me 3 grant cycles submitting my application with the facts in it until they finally granted me $400 to put this acoustimeter on loan in our public library. And they did it conditionally. I had to go in and meet with the board of trustees at our library and teach them what I thought I knew at the time. And ultimately, they took a 4-to-1 vote to put this into circulation in our libraries. And this conversation has gotten so much easier in recent years because libraries are having to reinvent themselves. So now one of the services they offer to the community is a library of things. So we may have been the first in the country to put one on loan in our library, but now I met a doctor at the first medical conference in 2019 out in California. And Dr. Tsafrir and I came back and went after a grant from our state level cultural council. We got an acoustimeter put in her library with some additional funding to do some education around it. And then out in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Verizon put a cell tower up on top of a neighborhood. And the day it turned on, people started getting sick. It got to the point where 17 children and adults got so sick, their Board of Health determined their homes were no longer able to be habitated by these families. So somebody in Pittsfield went to their library and they just funded the meter outright. And it's this one on the right, the Safe and Sound Pro 2 broadband radio frequency meters by Safe Living Technologies. And this is the one that was actually recommended at the EMF medical conference. So now we have doctors purchasing this, putting it into their medical practice, loaning it to their patients. And I met a Dr. Erin Acevedo up here on the North Shore in Massachusetts. She loans it to her patients for $10 to help cover the cost. And she says, you've got 2 hours, go home, do your scavenger hunt, write down what you're finding for readings in your home and where, come back and I will teach you how to turn that radiation off, but still have excellent technology connections. So that's something that anybody could perhaps do in your own community, is get these meters so that people can borrow it and everybody can share. And then every time you buy something, you can measure it, because with 5G and the Internet of Things, they're looking to put radio frequency radiating antennas in just about everything that you buy. So I have one of these meters here, and I'm going to put a pause on my screen share for a few minutes, and I'm going to give you a demonstration. So in the scientific literature, when I turn this on in our sleeping areas, they want us to be no more than 10 microwatts per square meter. That's the unit of measurement. So within like 3 feet of air, how much radiation do we have? So on this meter, as it boots up, you see all the green, yellow, red, and the number that's important is the middle one. It's called the max. What's the maximum spike of radiation that's hitting you? Because it's that spike that damages the cell. Right now in my home, I'm at 2, and we want to be under 10. So when I take my cell phone out of airplane mode, I never use it unless I'm on the go. And even then I keep it in airplane mode for emergencies. But watch what happens when I take it out of airplane mode. Oh boy. Let's see if I can make the sound a little quieter. So I'm not doing anything, but they give us these devices with multiple antennas. Each one is separately pulsing for a handshake with the nearest cell tower or router. So we have a Wi-Fi antenna, a Bluetooth antenna, a hotspot, a locator, cellular and data. And for anybody who didn't know any better and already upgraded to a 5G phone, you have additional antennas that now you know they're in there. Go in and turn off each one when you're not using it. So I'm going to put my cell phone back into airplane mode. and turn off those antennas, but I want to give you the new reading. See how it dissipates after a moment or two? Now I'm back into the safe green zone, but we went from 2 microwatts per square meter up to 1,080,000. 1,080,000 microwatts per square meter, and we want to be at 10 or less in our sleeping areas, which is my home. So it took me a while to get my head around this because I didn't want to believe it, because we had 5 decked cordless phones all over the house. They're like your own mini cell tower. I had my cordless keyboard, my cordless mouse, all my cordless everything, because we got sold on the convenience. But fortunately, I still had a box of Ethernet cables down in my basement. And I just one by one went around and measured and turned everything off. And then once I ran things through Ethernet cables, I then had amazing connections. So I'm going to go back into my screen share. But I want to give a shout out to our local cable stations. They are perhaps the last bastion of independent reporting left in our communities, because where we used to have 50 mainstream media channels, they've been bought out. They've been bought out. They've been bought out to the point where we have like 4 to 6 companies that own all of mainstream media, and they also happen to own all of these environmental polluters. So my local cable station was very kind. They came to my house. We did a walkthrough of common exposures, and that's there for you to look at to see, gee, what is radiating in my house? And then we offer suggestions for how to remove those exposures. I was brought in for a few interviews at the local cable station in Worcester, Massachusetts, and the program director there said, Cease, we just want to offer you your own show. So now I'm fortunate to go into the studio every couple of weeks and record a new video. And we try to showcase the scientists, the doctors, as well as the people who are being harmed, so that people can truly relate and understand, and perhaps through their stories, maybe recognize symptoms that they had no idea where they might be coming from. So we're very grateful to our local cable stations. But now let's actually walk you through the science, and we'll look at the long term and then the short term, and then the impact on not just you and I, but the planet. So in the long term, we now have clear evidence that this man-made radiation causes child and adult cancers. And over here, the U.S. National Toxicology Program, which is part of the National Institutes of Health, Environmental Health Sciences, they started more than 20 years ago to look at this. They were commissioned by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. There was enough evidence of harm that was suggesting we could be in trouble here. And so they spent 2 decades looking at 2G and 3G, because that was the technology of the day, through cell phones. And at the end of the day, they concluded clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage, among other findings. So DNA, we know, is what we need to grow a proper anything, from a human to a plant to a biome to whatever. And the industry, whenever one of these good studies comes out, because they own mainstream media, they control the messaging. So they'll downplay the good studies, and it's the big tobacco playbook all over again. They will oftentimes do their own studies rigged under conditions that would deliberately show no harm. Maybe they were only done for a short amount of time and the harm doesn't show up till later, or, whatever tricks they use. But another thing that they'll do is they'll say, oh, that NTP study, that was just one study. You need more science to prove anything's wrong here. Well, right as we concluded our major $30 million study here that showed clear evidence of cancers and DNA damage, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy concluded another large study on the cell tower base stations. And guess what? They found the same DNA damage, the same cancer. So it doesn't matter where this radiation is coming from. And the World Health Organization even clarified that in 2011. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. It's this pulsed, spiked, erratic, modulated signal that we now know today is causing so much damage. When I first started looking at the science, I was reading the infertility studies, and I had seen that they took male human sperm and exposed it to a laptop with the antennas radiating. And it changed the DNA, it slowed the motility of the sperm, and it caused apoptosis or programmed cell death. It was killing the sperm cells in just 4 hours of exposure. And I went, wait a minute. I had just sent my oldest daughter up to school with her MacBook. Our youngest had just gone into high school. So for Christmas, we gave her a laptop thinking we would give her a leg up on her studies. And then come to find out that this radiation causes infertility. And since then, Kaiser Permanente and others have also done studies showing higher miscarriage rates from young women or women using microwave technology. So that was when I first started finding my voice on this, because it really resonated with me that, holy moly, I spent 8 years bringing this technology into my children's schools. We had it all over our house. And now you're telling me it's extraordinarily harmful. That's when I put my little shaky knees together and raised my hand and said, I think we got a problem here. Dr. Martha Herbert founded the Autism Research Lab at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's a pediatric neurologist from Harvard. She was seeing huge connections between what we know happens with the autistic families in her care and what we know happens with microwave radiation exposures. Dr. Hugh Taylor heads up the OB/GYN program at Yale Medical School. He's done some of these rodent studies where he exposed the pregnant mice to this radiofrequency radiation. And lo and behold, when the pups were born, they started bouncing off the cages with attention issues, much like a child with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And then Dr. Martin Pall has culled the science on Alzheimer's. And it used to be like cancer. It would take decades for the harm to surface. And where we used to have Alzheimer's hitting people in their 70s and 80s and beyond, we are now seeing Alzheimer's in our 60s, in our 50s, in our 40s, in our 30s, and even in some rare cases in our 20s. So how long can we continue to expose the brain and our other organs to microwave radiation before we start seeing this societal collapse in our health? So we have a hard time getting this information out to the public because mainstream media is owned by these industries. So we're always so very grateful when more mainstream groups start getting funding to put resources toward this issue, like the Environmental Working Group. And as a mom, I first learned about EWG through their pesticide work. Every year they come out with a clean 15 and a dirty dozen list regarding the chemicals that go into growing our food. So they'll say, if you can, here's the dirty dozen, buy those as organically grown as you can. Then there's the clean 15, where the plant product itself has enough of a covering on it that you may not get quite a heavy chemical exposure if you buy these commercially grown. So I always had very high regard for the Environmental Working Group. And now they have resources. They have a PhD on staff now, and she is working with teams of experts, and they're putting out fact sheets on wireless radiation. This one here was protecting kids from wireless radiation in schools and at home. And this one was the effects of radiofrequency radiation on the central nervous system, because we can't continue to keep beating up our brains and our central nervous system with this radiation. And it's really important to step back and go, yeah, children are not just little adults. Biologically, they are even more vulnerable than you and I, and it's not good for us. Their skulls are not fully developed. They're thinner, and they have a higher water content in their brain. And just like when we throw a cup of coffee in the microwave oven, it vibrates and makes all these molecules move around in our food, and it heats it up, and that's what causes the microwave to work to heat our food. Well, when we microwave our brain, Dr. Om Gandhi did this modeling. So this is an adult. When you turn the head sideways, like this model is, the little yellow part is the ear. When you put the cell phone up to the ear, it pulsates into our brains about a third of the way. On a 10-year-old child, it goes in about 3/4 of the way through the brain. And on a 5-year-old child, that radiation is penetrating and permeating almost the entire brain. So we have got to step up and stop listening to industry, start using our common sense, learn the science, and start protecting ourselves and our loved ones. And we'll walk you through how to do that too. So in the short term, a lot of people are recognizing these symptoms. And it's important to know that the Americans with Disabilities Act 2 decades ago started recognizing that these electromagnetic sensitivities exist. And at this link, you'll see recommendations that they have for accommodations in our work settings. So the good news is when we come and learn about this, people start recognizing their symptoms. And the first reaction is, I don't want to know. I live off my devices. I don't want to hear this. But then they think, oh my gosh, I haven't slept in years. And then they'll turn it off. And then they'll come back and say, oh my goodness, I slept through the night for the first time in ages. Or headaches are going way down, or nosebleeds and ear bleeds are all but disappearing. And this is what happened in my house. My youngest daughter actually got a migraine in high school. What kid should be getting a migraine, right? And then she had chronic nosebleeds. And once we removed the wireless exposures from our house, those all but disappeared unless she allowed herself to get dehydrated. So for years, the industry would spin it. Oh, there's no mechanism of harm identified in the scientific literature, so we're just going to keep doing what we've always been doing. Well, now we know scientifically about the cancer. Now we know about the infertility. Now we know what's going on with the insomnia. We are biologically electrical beings, chemical and electrical beings. We have signaling that goes on, whispering to our cells night and day. As part of the circadian rhythm, which operates off of light and dark, in the wee hours of darkness, our brain releases melatonin that then goes in and regulates our sleep and does the toxic cell repair and escorting the toxins, from the debris that's left behind, escorted out of the body. Well, what's happening, as we know scientifically, the brain cannot distinguish between natural daylight and this man-made light energy form of radiation. So the brain's over there going, do, lights are on, when's it going to get dark so I can release that melatonin? And if we leave this invisible light form on during the sleeping hours, for a lot of people, that's enough to disrupt the melatonin release from the pineal gland. And then we also know another mechanism of harm that affects a lot of these issues, pain from identified sources, fatigue, chronic fatigue. Our red blood cells are meant to be free floating and bringing oxygen to all of our cells, all of our organs and important systems. When we have an electromagnetic field, it can cause our blood cells to glom together. And in my little brain, I remember it because of the candy Rolos before I cut back way back on sugar. I used to love those Rolos, that stack of caramel chocolates. Well, that's kind of what's happening when we magnetize our blood cells together. They stack up like that, and then that whole stack can no longer get to where those red blood cells need to go to bring the oxygen. So we find that we are beginning to suffer, and it's cumulative. The longer we expose ourselves, the more likelihood this damage is going to happen. But this is called the rouleau effect. And we now know that that's another mechanism of harm. Skin abnormalities. So it turns out we've got little antennas on the surface of our skin that help us to regulate ourselves out and about in our world. So if it's too hot, these little antennas tell us. If it's too cold, these little antennas tell us. So what happens when we overpower these little antennas with all this man-made radiation? Well, we start having things like people talk about getting the hot ear when they put a cell phone up to their head. We see people who get skin rashes, tingling, flushing, nerve damage when we start putting this right on top of our skin. So again, major organs, our brains, our heart, our lungs, meant to be synchronized with the Earth's natural electromagnetic field. And there was a gentleman whose last name was Schumann, who gave us Schumann's resonance. Schumann figured out that the Earth pulses these healthy electrons 7.83 times per second. That's beautiful, healing, free energy from the Earth. Pulse it up. regulate our bodies, pulse it up, regulate our bodies. Well, we got pretty fancy with digital technology. Instead of 7 or 8 times a second in the megahertz range, our wireless technology is pulsating at 1,000,000 times per second. In the gigahertz range, we're pulsating at 1,000,000,000 times per second. I don't know how you can cram 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 into anything in 1 second, but that's what this digital technology is. So we are getting very overpowered. So when we expose ourselves to these man-made frequencies, it dysregulates our own heartbeat, our own brain, our own lungs, and other organs. So people start getting heartbeats that are too fast or too slow based on what your own body does when it gets overpowered like that. Cognitive impairment, we can't think straight. Anger and behavior issues. It was frightening at the EMF medical conference to hear the doctors telling us, if we don't get a hold of this and we continue to damage with microwaves the gray matter and the white matter of the brain, we can full well expect to see many more of these societal outbursts that we've been seeing with the mass shootings. When we sent the kids back to school after the pandemic, after we issued every child a wireless tablet to go access their education with not one shred of safety training, we had 3 different schools here in Boston reporting in the news that children were taking their wireless tablet and literally beating on their classmates with it. So we are damaging the brain with this, and we can't keep doing it. I mentioned that to a teacher at my gym recently, and she said, oh my gosh, we had a teacher go out on disability because one of the kids beat her up with his tablet. So we have to address this. And, you know, we were at epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation long before the pandemic. The cumulative effect was already happening to the point that 60% of college freshmen pre-pandemic were reporting serious anxiety in the 12 months prior to enrolling in college. So we have huge room for improvement here. And Dr. Martin Pall has a good paper out here that tells us about these neuropsychiatric effects, including depression. And all of this you will find at this link. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not just you and I. We can't overpower every biological cell on the planet and expect that our world is going to remain the same. So our poor little pollinators that are disappearing by the species by the dozens, they have their own mechanisms. You know, maybe the birds have magnetite in their beaks, but they've all got something built into their brains and their heads that allow them to synchronize with the Earth's electromagnetic field, 7.83 times per second. What happens when we put in this giant layer of electrosmog? Well, they can't find their way back to their hives, to their nests. When they turned on 5G in The Hague in the Netherlands, birds literally dropped out of the sky by the dozens, either stunned or killed from the microwaves hitting them. For those concerned about energy consumption, more than a decade ago, a Greenpeace analyst looked at the data and said, if the cloud, you know, the euphemism for all of our energy consumption with technology, if the cloud were a country, it would be the 5th largest consumer of energy in the world. And that was over a decade ago in 2012. Look how much more industry has pushed on us since then. So this is a huge contributor to the problems we're having. And you can go to my Planetary Impact link and learn about the human atrocities that are happening to get the dozens of minerals that go into every single one of our devices. Once we get our head around this, I don't think many of us would just say, oh, look, there's a new shiny object. Let me go buy that because the industry is promoting all this convenience and all this wonderful stuff. We would use every single thing we buy to its full and useful life and then make sure we recycle it on the backside. Data warehouses, networks, personal devices for streaming, sending, receiving, charging and recharging and recharging and recharging. All the apps that we've been talked into putting on that honestly, we probably don't even use. They're all in the background consuming energy to do updates. So When we know better, we can do better. Start clearing all that stuff off and only use what you need for the shortest amount of time that you can get away with. Don't let your devices, especially wirelessly, be your playground. If you need to stream something, download it onto your device, go into the settings, turn off all the antennas, and then you can enjoy whatever is on your device without radiating yourself and everybody around you. So it's a mind bender, and we know it, but you can make minor changes today, baby steps that may have you feeling much better tomorrow. So when I fell down the rabbit hole with this, I'm over here scratching my head, reading the science going, wow, surely somebody's got our backs on this. If this is as bad as little me can find and read in the scientific literature. So that was my missing puzzle piece. Why don't we know? And then in 2015, the Harvard Law School Center for Ethics came out with this amazing free online report called Captured Agency: How the Federal Communications Commission is Dominated by the Industries it presumably regulates. So the graphic that they chose on the cover of this report sums it up. We have a revolving door between the wireless industry and our federal agencies. And I went, oh, so there is no cavalry coming. There's nobody coming from on high to protect you and I. And more recently, ProPublica last November put out this additional in-depth report on how the FCC shields these cell phone companies from safety concerns, because the FCC and the industry are one and the same today. So I mentioned that $30 million study done by the National Toxicology Program that was commissioned decades ago by the Food and Drug Administration. Well, all the folks who worked there back then and were concerned about this issue, they're long gone. They've either died or retired. And the gentleman today who heads up the radiation area at the Food and Drug Administration, his name is Dr. Jeffrey Shuren. Dr. Jeffrey Shuren is married to a woman who is a partner in a law firm that represents the wireless industry and other environmental polluters. So Dr. Jeffrey Shuren should have been nowhere near this study. He has a huge conflict of interest. But sadly, this goes all the way up to the top, to the World Health Organization. They opened an investigation in 2011, and they determined that this is a Group 2B possible human carcinogen. And that's the middle of 5 categories. They knew enough that they couldn't just dismiss it. But what was missing at the time were the rodent studies or the animal studies. And now that we have those done, they have reopened their investigation. And the scientists who really know this and are qualified to comment, they are saying this should at least be a probable human carcinogen, at which point public policy has to be put in place for protections. Or others are also saying, we know it causes cancer. This is a Group 1 known human carcinogen. So I was presenting to a school health and wellness committee not too long ago. And as I'm presenting the facts, somebody else is fact checking me. And they said, well, the New York Times says this is 5G is fine. That's just the Russians fear mongering that there's something wrong with 5G. And how would you know that the New York Times is now very deep in bed with industry? They've got them on their board, and they have a 5G test lab at the New York Times. So organizations that we used to be able to trust, we just really need to get to the non-industry funded, independent scientific literature and make up our own minds, because mainstream media is not giving us the facts anymore. So somebody else went right to the World Health Organization. And when you first go there, you will find things from years ago up front that are saying, oh, gee, nothing to look at here. You know, the science is still inconclusive. Look at the dates on everything you look at, because here the World Health Organization has actually reopened their investigation on cancer effects. And now they're including infertility. Now they're including the environmental impact. Now they're including the impact on children and senior citizens and what it's doing to the population that's becoming more and more electromagnetically sensitive. But you don't find that when you go to the World Health Organization, because it turns out there's two groups there that are charged with looking at electromagnetic fields. One is the scientists who are qualified trying to get word out. The other is a very heavily industry funded group. So you're hard pressed to even get to the truth through the World Health Organization. But if you go to this link, you'll be able to drill down to get to this new investigation they're doing. But sadly, it looks like they're stacking this investigation with unqualified, heavily industry influenced people. So there's no cavalry coming. We have to learn this for ourselves, and we have to take charge of our own lives, our families, and ultimately our communities. And we've got so many resources. But in the vein of looking at what you can do today, just start noticing, what do I have under my control? I figured out that when I looked at my router, either on the back or on the bottom, there's Ethernet ports. All you have to do is hardwire your technology, and that just means go find your Ethernet cables again. And if you have to buy new ones, look for something called a shielded Ethernet cable. That just has a layer of foil wrapped around the wires inside the plastic case. And what that does is that prevents that dirty electricity from coming up, or high electric or magnetic fields from coming into your living space. So upgrade by just a couple dollars and get it shielded if you need to buy something new. Most of us have more than one device in our homes today that we'd like to hardwire. So just buy something called an Ethernet switch. You can think of it as an extension cord or an extension box for technology. And then you just get little cables for each one of your devices. And who knew, you can buy little $30 adapters for your phones or your tablets or your laptops and just plug it all in. So that's the first step, is just inexpensive hardwiring. Most people can afford maybe $100 to hardwire. And then simply forward your cell phone calls to your landline. I know some people gave up their landline because they got talked into it, but that is safer technology. You can forward your cell phone calls to your landline and then go into every device and turn off those antennas. I sat down and called my internet provider and said, hey, we chose to hardwire my house, but that triple play box for cable, internet, and phone is down in my basement utility room, just off the charts with radiation. How can I turn off the antennas in that triple play box? And the guy on the phone said, oh, that's easy. Sit down at your computer. And I went, really? And he said, yeah, I'm going to walk you into how to get into your account online. And then he walked me in and taught me to click on wireless. And I clicked on that. And then there was a 2.4 gigahertz antenna and a 5 gigahertz antenna. And I just went off, off. I clicked the apply button. I got a warning message saying, you're cutting everybody's Wi-Fi off. And I went, yes, thank you very much. And I waited for it to dissipate. And then I took out my meter and I measured. And literally, it was radio silence in my home. So these are the baby steps that we can all take to control the devices under our control. Remember, this was never meant to be when we're stopped and we're in a stationary place. This is meant to be mobile technology. But then they saw other opportunities for revenue streams, putting boosters in our home and, all Wi-Fi all the time, yada, yada. So first we have to hardwire, then we have to turn off those antennas. And then it's critically important to measure, because the industry is now forecasting that, for those who don't know better, you're going to have up to 200 wireless antennas in your home. So we already know that your cell phone has at least 6 in there. We know that the laptops have multiple antennas. My printer has multiple antennas. So your mouse, your keyboard, all of it, just start thinking toward hardwiring. But if you don't measure, you won't know. For example, our stove died, and my husband got this great floor model for a discount price. And when it came and got delivered, it had a Wi-Fi logo on it. And I went, uh-oh. So I went into the settings to see if there was a place for me to turn off that antenna, and there wasn't. So I pulled up the manual and I start finding the RF exposure section, the radio frequency. And it says in that warning in there, stay 20 centimeters away from this. And I'm like, so Okay, so you put this antenna in my stove and you want me to stand in the middle of my kitchen and pretend I'm going to cook from that far away? It's just ludicrous. There's no common sense to these solutions. So I had to call the tech to come to my house. And when the repairman got there, he had no idea what I was talking about. I showed him that this antenna in my stove was radiating 1,010,000 microwatts per square meter. And that before that stove showed up, I was at like a 2 or a 3. Well, he wasn't very interested in learning any of that. He didn't know what to do. So he called his engineers. Actually, he stormed out of my house and he said, fine, I'll go wait in my car. So he went back out to his van and came back in, pulled off the back panel of my stove, and behind the digital display where the motherboard is, right next to the motherboard, there was this little tiny circuit. And all he had to do was unplug that. That was the wireless antenna. And then I remeasured. I was back into the safe zone in my home. And to his credit, as he was walking out the door, he said, I don't buy any appliances with digital technology. And I said, yeah, but Home Depot and Lowe's, they all just have the latest and greatest, which is all this Internet of Things stuff. He said, nope, I just go online and I order good, solid appliances, and I don't let that stuff in my house. And I went, well, thank you for that tip. So people are teachable. Everybody wants to learn if you can present it factually. And we do these free webinars twice a month. So you don't have to have a total grasp on all the facts. People can just come and learn with us. So first, take control of what you have control over. But there are other things that we don't have control over. 3 specific areas. The utility smart meters. So when I was a little girl, I'm the youngest of 10 kids. And so we spent a lot of time outdoors playing hide and seek. And I would hide in the bushes waiting to be found. And, with 10 kids, it could be quite a while. And I would keep myself entertained by just watching the little dials going around on the analog meters that we had for gas, water, electric. And today we now have solar and propane. But those little dials indicated how much we were consuming of whatever that utility was. And then they would have somebody walk the neighborhood once a month, take down our reading, and that's how we got our bill. Well, the industry in recent years has come through and said, hey, we can save your town some money. You won't have to pay the neighborhood walker anymore. We'll put on a digital device, and that will automatically send the data off to the utility, and then you'll get your bills. Well, doesn't that sound like great? It's going to be a cost save for our town. So, of course, all of our towns said, thank you, that's amazing. But what the industry didn't tell our towns is that if you look at these meters that are mounted on your home or in your basement, if there's an FCC ID number, that means they're sending this data using microwave radio frequency radiation. So when I was preparing to testify before the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, I'm in an area of Massachusetts where they do not give us the right to opt out of this technology. I want that old analog meter back. I don't want to radiate my family. So how often do these things pulse the radiation? The industry will come off and say, oh, it's just a couple seconds a day. It's not a big deal. When I sat there with my meter next to my dining room wall where the solar and the electric meters are sitting, that pulsed, when I did the math, 17,000 times a day. So if you've got somebody next to this smart meter mounted outside or in your basement, that's 17,000 times you're getting microwaved every day. So these are not smart. They're not good for our community. They pulse this radiation continuously. And one of the properties of radio frequency radiation is it likes metal. It amplifies with metal. So if it's not done properly, it can hop on the wires and the pipes of your home and turn your whole home into one big, giant radiating antenna. And there are far too many reports of improper grounding that's causing fires or explosions with power surges. And one of the things we need to know about an electrical fire like this is you can't just bring in the fire department and hose it down. With an electrical fire, you first have to go to the utility company, and they need the time they need to take to get in there and to cut off the electricity before you can treat the fire. That can be up to an hour. And if it's a windy day, you can be burning down your whole neighborhood. Data harvesting and privacy issues are also huge, and you can read more about that. And at the medical conference, they said this implementation of smart meter technology has been one of the leading causes of sudden onset microwave sicknesses. When these meters go on homes, the doctors are seeing sick patients come through the door. This is also a major environmental justice issue. For example, out here in Worcester, Massachusetts, National Grid came in with their wonderful new smart grid pilot program. They go into these underprivileged, minority, impoverished communities where people are working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep a roof over the head and food on the table. They don't have time to look up and see, oh, okay, something's coming in. I don't know what is, what, nobody's even questioning it. Well, the smart grid went way over budget, and the utilities wanted to come back and slap the ratepayers with their mismanagement of the funding and make their customers pay for this. So our Attorney General's office got involved on the economic side of it, and we've been educating them on the biological side of it as well. But, you know, in true environmental justice fashion, the wireless industry is coming in just like other environmental polluters. They'll roll out their program and go, hey, look, it was successful here. Now we're going to roll it out all across your state. And hey, New York, hey, Connecticut, hey, Rhode Island, look how great this was in Massachusetts. So you want to be adopting this too, right? So these are the tactics that these big industries use. Jeremy Johnson was a Silicon Valley engineer. His wife is a medical doctor, and they both wound up in short order, very sick with the anxiety, the depression, the insomnia, the headaches, and nothing in her medical training could inform her on what was going on until they discovered there was a bank of smart meters that were put in at their condo. So now Jeremy has done a wonderful 15-minute TEDx talk. And it's really hard sometimes to open this conversation with engineers and physicists and technologists, because the industry has only taught them that you have to have heat from a radiating device before there can be any harm. So that's what our FCC limits are set to, is this heat or thermal threshold that allows this much radiation. But we now know the science is showing the biological harm is at hundreds of thousands of times way below what our governments still allow. So it can sometimes lend credibility to the conversation to point engineers over to Jeremy Johnson's TEDx talk, or Dr. Alexia McKnight. She was so great. She brought me in to do a program for her children's schools with her to share her experience and the science. Well, Dr. McKnight actually works with radiation. She's a veterinarian radiologist, and so they know the precautions you take for ionizing radiation. That's why we wear lead aprons when we get an X-ray, and we don't leave ourselves or our children out in the sun 24 hours a day. We need to use common sense and protect ourselves. So poor Dr. McKnight, she was in her home, and they put a smart meter on, and she didn't really make the connection, but she got sick, you know, neurologically damaged in short order, couldn't sleep, anxiety, depression. Then something happened on her home. They had to take that smart meter off, and there was a gap in time, and all of her symptoms went away. And then that smart meter, they put another one back on her home, and sure enough, within a few days, all these neurological symptoms were happening, to the point where she was driving out in traffic and she could not remember if a green light meant stop or go. It was a 50-50 proposition. She made the right choice and she got through, but it freaked her out. And then come to find out, it was that smart meter on her home that was doing the damage to her. So she did a TEDx talk too that you might want to watch. So again, we're trying to provide you with credible resources, believable resources to share this information. So our own devices, the smart meters, and then there's the cell towers. They started 300 feet up in the air in industrial parks. And then when the wireless industry got the Telecom Act passed in 1996, they said, well, you can't complain if there's any harm to the environment. And a court or two at the federal level has said, well, that environment means humans as well. Not every court has done that, but a couple of them have. So they said, however, that if there is an aesthetic concern or if there's a gap in coverage, then, if there's no gap in coverage, then you can perhaps push back against where the industry wants to put these cell tower antennas. So they started way off in industrial parks. Then they started encroaching closer and closer and closer. Now they're putting them on our buildings, on the side of the buildings, on the rooftops. And they think so long as you could just paint it the same color, then it's aesthetically fine, right? So it's critically important to help our towns understand that we need to look at the non-industry funded science and see what's going on with these cell towers. And that's why being a tech writer, I got way in over my head and I couldn't remember where to find credible information. So I just started my own simple research repository so I can get back and find things that I need to reread or I want to share with somebody. So I created a very simple research repository called Understanding EMFs, these electromagnetic fields, because I didn't understand what this was. I built a page for cell towers and I started culling the science and putting in the studies that are saying, hey folks, there is a death and neurotoxicity curve out in society where the epidemiologists, these are the scientists who study what's actually happening out there. Others study in vivo and in vitro in the science labs, but the epidemiologists look to see what's actually happening in society. And they looked and they saw that there's this death and neurotoxicity curve that starts to come down at 500 meters. It doesn't actually catch up to the general population until twice that at like 1,000 meters, which 500 meters is 1,640 feet. So it's more than 3,000 feet. We should all be away from any radiating device like that because it was the brain tumors, the heart tumors, the insomnia, the anxiety, the depression, all of that was much higher inside that little bell curve. So there's a website called antennasearch.com where you can go put in an address and it'll give you a 3-mile return of how many antennas and cell towers there are within 3 miles of that address. So when I put it in for my house here in Ashland, Massachusetts, I get maybe 100, 150 of these big antennas. When I put in the State House address down in Boston, there were 1,520 towers and a total of 4,512 of these big giant antennas. We are literally frying our major cities, and now it's seeping out into our smaller communities as well. But this is how densified it was in one neighborhood in Boston called Hyde Park. But look at that. Where are you going to go in your neighborhood and not get radiated? So it's critically important that we look at the science, and you can see maps and stuff out there at antennasearch.com. So cell towers, smart meters. If your town offers a smart meter opt-out, really take advantage of that. My town doesn't, unfortunately. But now the third thing is these small cells. So 5G simply means 5th generation technology. It came after 4th and 4G and 3rd generation and 3G. But it's a whole new technology. They're getting away with spinning it up that we're going to have faster entertainment downloads, smart cities, super highways, all what sounds great and cool. But when you go and look at it, it's actually a new revenue stream for them because they are buying the entertainment industry as they push all this streaming at us. And it's not like 5G can fly all by itself. This is what some of it looks like, these little cylindrical antennas and stuff. It could be these small rectangular ones. They could be hanging them on wires. They could be putting them under manhole covers, in which case we would never even know we're standing right on top of a very, very toxic antenna. But they can't fly by themselves because our 3G and 4G signals use these longer wavelengths that have no problem getting through objects like buildings to get in and reach your devices indoors. All that's left to monetize are these tiny little millimeter waves. And so the industry is going to squeeze as many nickels out of that as they can. And so they have to pair the 3G and the 4G big wavelengths and then pile these 5G wavelengths on top. But because these are so little and they're carrying such vast quantities of data, they, first of all, they can't go through objects like the longer wavelengths. We're adding on this new layer of electrosmog. And in order for this to fly, they can't go far. So they are saying, we're now going to put a cell tower every 2 to 12 houses inside our neighborhoods for 5G and the Internet of Things. So their antennas can sync up with your 5G devices. So now people are literally waking up with cell towers outside their homes. And the industry doesn't care at all about the environment. They have come in and just lopped off the trees. They're not working with arborists. So it's a raw deal. And in this little clip here, Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut at the federal level was in a hearing, and he said to the industry, so tell us, how much money have you invested to prove that 5G is safe before bringing it to market? And these two industry guys kind of hemmed and hawed and were ultimately made to admit that they know of no independent studies that have been done. So Senator Blumenthal said, so as far as health and safety are concerned, we are flying blind here. And that's what industry does. Put it out there, ask questions later. And, you know, the publishers are like Computer World are saying 5G is a bad joke. It's not even delivering these faster speeds or whatever. 4G was just as fast. So we've been sold once again a bill of goods by a greedy industry that cares only about their bottom line and not about finding the balance between healthy technology and healthy people. So lots of great information out there. Dr. Magda Havas retired from Trent University up in Canada, where she taught electromagnetic fields for decades. And she recognizes that our government has dropped the ball. Most of our governments around the world have dropped the ball on measuring, because she knows it's cumulative and we just keep adding on layer upon layer upon layer of this electro pollution. And so she started her global EMF monitoring project. And for anybody who invests in the Safe Living Technologies Safe and Sound Pro 2 meter, and by the way, if you reach out to this global EMF monitoring project, the folks at this meter company are offering a discount to anybody who agrees to be a citizen scientist for Dr. Havas. And go out there, and she's got a little protocol you can put on your clipboard and go up and down the main strip of your town, like 4 or 5 consecutive intersections, and do measurements. And she'll teach you how to wave this thing around and get proper measurements, and then enter it into her database. She calls it her brag project, as in, can you brag about the exposures in your town? So B is for blackout. It's very high, over 100,000 microwatts. Red, R is for red, high in the red zone, right? 10,000 to 100,000. A is for amber. We're getting toward trouble here. 1,000 to 10,000. And then G is for green. In Salzburg many years ago, a lot of the scientists got together and said, okay, so long as you're not outside standing right underneath a radiating device for any period of time, even if we could get these levels down to 1,000 or less, and if we had a clean space at home where our bodies can do proper cell repair and regeneration, even if we could get it down to 1,000 outdoors, that might be sort of okay. So Dr. Havas invites people to go to her globalemf.net website and sign up. And if you don't have a meter and you would like to get that Safe and Sound Pro 2, she can send you a discount code to use when you order the meter. So what do some common outdoor measurements look like today? The goal, again, is less than 1,000 microwatts per square meter. Lori, who's part of New Hampshire for Safe Tech, she measured her local fire station, looking pretty good. In Keene, New Hampshire, they were getting into the danger zone, and now we know that they've since put in 5G small cells and that the higher readings are coming in. Nashua was already in the red, Concord already in the red, that's where their capital is. Stratham, New Hampshire, where Deb is from, who's co-hosting with us today, she and I went up we did the Concord reading, we did the Stratum reading, and they had put a big cell tower right down their main drag, and that's why that's so high. See this pretty little seemingly beautiful light post? This is actually a cell tower at the curb, right in one of Boston's most popular neighborhoods. It's called the North End, and that's where all of our amazing Italian restaurants and bakeries are. But when you look right above the storefronts, we have people living up there, and they're putting these antennas right outside people's homes. We measured over 500,000 outdoors just standing at a street corner in the North End. So this is happening all over our cities and towns. So that's all the bad news. So we'll spend just a few minutes talking about the good news. Dr. Martin Luther King taught us that when we have meaningful change in our society, it comes through 3 channels. First, the public gets informed and uses their voices. Second, it goes through the courts, and the guilty, in this case, the polluters, are held accountable to the scientific literature. And finally, public policy catches up, in this case, to the science, and then we get protections in place. So let's go through a minute or two on each one of these and give us great inspiration and hope, because there are people all over the world working very hard to help us get through this. So legal solutions. I mentioned that the gentleman, Dr. Shuren, who's heading up the FDA today, basically said, we don't believe our own government study that shows, cancer and all sorts of horrible things. He went over to the FCC and said, nothing to look at here. Keep doing what you're doing. Now, remember, he's got conflicts of interest because his wife works for a law firm that represents the industry. So Dr. Shuren goes and tells the FCC, nothing to look at here. Keep doing what you're doing. As soon as the FCC put that in writing and entered their determination into what's called the Federal Registry, once they officially said, we're not changing our radiation exposure limits that were set back in the 90s, which has nothing to do with what we're radiating at today. Once they said, we're not changing anything, then the lawsuits began. So the Environmental Health Trust, Children's Health Defense, and others all sued, and these lawsuits all got combined, and it went in under Environmental Health Trust versus the Federal Communications Commission. And there had been an open docket at the FCC for 6 years, into which scientists and doctors and families who had been injured put all their testimonies and their science in, and they closed that docket. But what the people who sued did is they went back through the docket and they pulled everything out, 11,000 pages of evidence of harm, and they put it into 27 big fat binders and handed that to the 3 judges in I think it was the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, handed them literally thousands of pages of evidence of harm. And they're reading this, and they go to the attorneys at the FCC and say, so how did you determine that you want to stick with those 1996 radiation levels? And they did one of these, the FDA said it was okay. So the judges, of course, asked, where's the FDA's homework? And there is none. Not one of our federal agencies has done the formal review of the science showing incredible harm. So we've got a huge regulatory gap, but they won that lawsuit. And actually, it's kind of funny. Sometimes I think God's got a good sense of humor, but it was on Friday, the 13th of August, 2021, that the courts ruled, and they sent it back and said, FCC, you've been arbitrary and capricious. You need to go back and relook at your public radiation exposure limits. But they didn't set a deadline. So now it's been 2 years and the FCC has done nothing. And it will likely be a couple more years before anything happens. So we can't wait for higher authorities to fix this for us. The harm is happening right now. And when you get my slides, you can go through all these other lawsuits from all over the country, all over the world. And a couple of them that are worth mentioning here is that I mentioned that Pittsfield lawsuit where Verizon put a cell tower on top of a neighborhood. And after 1.5 years of pleading with their town, The town finally ordered their Board of Health to investigate. The Board of Health did, and they figured out the facts pretty quickly. They wrote a cease and desist order to Verizon. Come, you've got 7 days, come to the table, let's sort this out. There's already another business in town on commercial property that would be more than happy to take your revenue to put the cell tower over there instead of on top of a residential neighborhood. Verizon, being Verizon, one of the worst in the industry, the attorneys will tell you, went to the court and got an injunction against the Pittsfield Board of Health, saying, we don't think you have any right to issue an emergency order because the FCC Telecom Act of 1996 says we get to put this stuff wherever we want to put it, basically. But the Board of Health had done its homework. They had spoken to the Massachusetts Association of Health Boards and a team of attorneys at the state level, and they believe they have determined that, okay, so that telecom law does exist, but that only applies to the siting of a cell tower. Once something goes active in the community, if it's a nuisance or if it's causing harm to the people or the environment, it is the legal, by law, responsibility of that Board of Health to fix it. So the Board of Health knew it might take them maybe 1 or 2 different paths to take this through the courts, and maybe the sum total was like $86,000, which for a big city is not that much. They have emergency reserves for things like this, but their mayor and their city council refused to back their Board of Health, which they told to go investigate. They would not back their own Board of Health. So now citizens, with the help of Children's Health Defense, are suing the town of Pittsfield for not allowing their Board of Health. The Board of Health was basically bullied into rescinding that cease and desist order. So now there's a lawsuit to get that cease and desist order reinstated and rescind that injunction from Verizon. We hope we'll hear about that in the next couple of months. So that's one that the whole world is watching. For the first time in the United States, at the Fay School in Massachusetts here, they recognize that you don't have to have heat to have harm. Enough evidence was brought into this court case where a little boy was getting really sick at this prestigious international boarding school. And for the first time, the courts ruled you don't have to have heat to have harm. So although we prefer the big wins so we can just fix this, every win that happens builds for the next case, and then we ultimately prevail. So feel free to pound around if you want to know much more about the legal cases. So educate the public, take it through the courts. The third thing is to bring public policy in line with the science. And as I mentioned, we've had bills here for 10 years. We've gotten them out of committee, but then the session expires and we have to go back to square one the next session. So we are so very grateful to Deb Hodgson and all the others in New Hampshire who have worked very hard on this with their legislators. And when she taught Representative Patrick Abrami what had happened to her, how she got so sick from the Wi-Fi in her home, he's an engineer who, of course, have only been taught you have to have heat to have harm. He's a good man, though. He started looking at the science and had a major wow moment, like, wow, what are we doing here? And so Deb introduced him to me. They jumped in his car from New Hampshire and drove down to my home in Massachusetts. And we sat around my kitchen table for the afternoon. I made a big pot of nice organic gluten-free chicken noodle soup. And we helped him to learn the facts. And he beefed up this bill he was writing and asked very pointed questions. First, why have Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, AM Best, and others already long since recognized radio frequency radiation puts them at great risk, and they no longer have coverage? They put exclusions in their insurance policy. So that should raise a giant red flag for all of our towns, that our towns are going to be on the hook for damages if there's not proper insurance in place. His bill asked, why does the legal fine print that we talked about earlier in our presentation today, why does that even exist to tell us to keep this off the body? Why is the FCC ignoring all the science? And why do they only address the heating effects and not the non-thermal, non-ionizing, low-level biological effects that are well documented? And why do they allow 100 times more radiation than certain countries like India and China and Russia? Why are we frying our citizens at this level when they've brought it down to a much lower level? And why is nobody looking at the cumulative exposures? Because remember, they only tested this for heat. And at that, it was only for 6 minutes or 30 minutes from one radiating antenna. Now we've got 6+ antennas in our phones. Now we've got multiple antennas in our laptops and our tablets. Now we've got wearables. Now we've got baby monitors. Now we've got gaming devices. Now we've got wireless home security. Now we've got wireless appliances. Nobody is accounting for this densification of electropollution. So by some miracle, we brought in the experts, and within 7 months' time, we got this through the House Committee on Science, Tech, and Energy. We got it through the Health and Human Services Committee, and then it went under Governor Sununu's pen, and he signed it into law. We've got 1 year to investigate, and this then became the time of the pandemic. And even during the pandemic, that commission of highly qualified doctors, scientists, engineers, their Department of Health, their Attorney General's office, plus they kept 2 seats at the table for the industry, so we get all the information out there at once. And so they came out with this groundbreaking commission report that documents the conflicts of interest with the wireless industry, the FDA and the FCC. They said to the FDA and FCC, please come meet with us. They wouldn't. They just pointed to this garbage that they've got posted up on their websites. And so they voted 10-3 to put this commission report out there that documents the harm and makes 15 recommendations for how to start transitioning away from wireless for primary connectivity, because it's no longer advanced technology. Migrate over to hardwired fiber optics to and through the premises. And then we just pick up with Ethernet cables and adapters indoors and turn off all the antennas and then measure. So Dr. Kent Chamberlain was appointed to this commission, and Dr. Chamberlain at the time was the chairperson and professor of the University of New Hampshire Department of Computer and Electrical Engineering. So he's been a career man in electromagnetic fields. He's developed medical devices, well-published, well-established. He thought, of course, Wi-Fi is fine, right? Well, Dr. Chamberlain gets in there and does a complete 180 once he starts doing the investigation. So he did a 20-minute presentation on this bill, and he also provides his slides. And then from there, the next step is you now have to enact legislation that takes these recommendations and puts them into law so that we can then legally go out there and start making changes in our communities. Well, every time we get a bill, doesn't the industry come in and upend it and defeat it? So Frank Clegg, who's the retired president of Microsoft Canada, you might want to share his testimony with others, where he indicates wireless tech is no longer advanced tech. It's outlived its useful life as a main source of connectivity. It should be used in reserve for a short amount of times, and then retrain ourselves to access the internet and our landline phones when we're not on the go. So we've made great inroads, but I'll tell you, every single time we get there, the industry comes in and trounces us. So we can't wait for higher ups to fix this. We've got to address it for ourselves, our families, and then ultimately public policy catches up. But we want to keep working at it from the top and the bottom. Dr. Cindy Russell, who founded Physicians for Safe Technology, she calls it the hamburger approach. Keep educating at the grassroots level. Keep educating up here at the legislative level. And somewhere in the middle, we will meet. So that's her hamburger approach. So New Hampshire had a bill, excuse me, this year that would undo what the industry did in their state law that made it feel like our local municipalities had their hands tied. They don't actually. There's still a lot our towns can do, and we'll give you the tools to learn that as well. Maine saw what New Hampshire had done, and they introduced through a nurse who's also a state representative. Her adult children and her constituents were telling her about this wireless issue. So she introduced a bill this session. She got it unanimously through the House twice. But when it came to the Senate, where there's been a lot of heavy industry influence over the years, they rejected it. So there's hope. You know, each one builds off the next. In Connecticut, Representative David Michel and Representative Ann Hughes, they introduced a bill that would take a look at these small cells and smart meters that are showing up right at the home level. And then here we've had 6 bills this session. 5 of the 6 we've already had our hearings on. You're welcome to go listen to our 2 to 3 minute testimonies and just learn literally from people who are living this nightmare and those who are trying to fix it. So we have a bill that we've had now for 8 years to do what New Hampshire did in 7 months, form a commission. We've also had a bill for that long to protect kids from handheld devices. We have a Wi-Fi in schools bill to get the state level Department of Education to look at this issue and start protecting us in our schools. We've had for 10 years now a smart meter choice bill. And this year, Senator Mike Moore introduced it as an emergency bill with an emergency preamble because National Grid and Eversource and Unitil are saying that their current fleet of meters are aging out. So in the next year or two, they want to come in and replace everything with the smart grid, which just exponentially opens up layers and layers of microwave radiation that are going to hit you and I and everybody if we don't stop it. And at least as a first step, give us the right to opt out of that. And now we have a bill. Massachusetts has pretty good civil rights law, but attorney Scott McCullough, who sued the FCC on behalf of Children's Health Defense, he helped our legislature to write this bill that would strengthen our civil rights law to give people the right when going out in public or to stores or hotels or wherever they need to go to access society, to have a right to say, I need to have a white zone, I need to have a safe space. Or I heard recently from colleagues up in Canada that some of the big stores are now creating white zones in the morning, maybe the first hour. People who have sensitivities could come in and do their shopping then. And it's a lot of the people on the autism spectrum get that sensory overload. So it's not just the electromagnetically sensitive, it's also people in the autism community and those with other diagnoses that make them unable to go into a place that's got these bright LED lights or the fluorescent lights that could, you know, it's another bad form of man-made energy. So there's hope. And by passing this law, we could strengthen our civil rights so that we can ask for accommodations. And then one of the gaps that exists is that so many people are getting sick and they'll tell their town health agent or they'll tell their doctors and nurses, but there's nowhere to gather that data. So Scott McCullough helped Representative Tricia Farley Bouvier, who has that Verizon cell tower in Pittsfield, right in her own neighborhood. He helped her to write this bill. We already have a database in Massachusetts that our health departments rely on and our medical community relies on to put data in for Parkinson's, to put data in for food poisoning or for COVID. Now it's time that electromagnetic sensitivity be recognized and included in that database so people can put the data in, and with better data, we can make better policy decisions. So we're very, you know, we don't hold our breath because for whatever reason, we move like molasses in Massachusetts. But sometimes after many sessions, we hit the tipping point and these bills start to get passed. So we would be very grateful to anybody who wants to send in a statement. You can go to each one of these links and it will tell you how to send in a statement of support. We look forward to testimony from all over the world. So wherever you are, please tell your story. And then I have a link on my Understanding EMF's database about bills in other states. So the industry routinely comes in when they submit an application and the community starts going, hey, wait a minute. The industry turns around to our towns and says, oh, ignore those guys. Those are just the NIMBYs. These are just the people not in my backyard, right? And they'll say, nobody else cares. Well, that again is another hunk of disinformation that they routinely give our towns. When in reality, if you go out to Americans for Responsible Technology on their website, they've already got more than 150 groups all over the country that are speaking up about this. And you can dive into some of this, but these are just local examples of where people are succeeding in updating their zoning code and pushing back at industry's disinformation campaign that leaves our towns thinking their hands are tied, when in fact they're not. So it's great when towns start taking action. City of Boston filed a complaint with the FCC along with many towns across the country saying, we believe the citizens, we need to look at this. So lots of stuff going on, and our friends at Americans for Responsible Technology take all the best of the good, and they come up with guidelines that all of our towns can use. So feel free to poke around to help muster up the courage and what others are doing. And I love this one. In Easton, Connecticut, a grandmother figured out what 5G really is with these close range toxic cell antennas. And she went to her local boards, and there was a doctor on one of the boards, and he knew how to look at the science, and they put a moratorium. We don't want 5G in our town until it's proven safe. And they just re-upped that moratorium, I think spring of last year. So it can be done. And, it's happening all over the world, but we just don't hear about it. So we just go with the flow and do whatever industry guides us into. But I want to let you know there's some really good resources for us, because right now the industry is targeting our schools. First, they targeted it with the 21st century classroom to bring wireless into the schools. And now they're targeting our schools to put cell towers and 5G small cells right at the schools too. So let's take a look at the good stuff, right? There's a Dr. Holly Grow down in New Orleans, and she banded together a group of doctors who all have specialties. She's an ophthalmologist. So what is all this technology doing to our eyes? Well, it's causing an epidemic of myopia and retinal detachments. And then she brought in a cardiologist. What's this technology doing to our hearts? And then she brought in wellness experts on the lifestyle choices and the obesity and the anxiety and the depression. So their first law here talks about, we need a law, and the output needs to be best practices for using digital devices today in our schools. So they address all this whole balance of screen time versus green time. We should be outside. We know children do not develop best in front of a screen. They need physical movement. They need to be running around. They need to have human touch, not the shallows of a screen. They need to be out in their environment, and they need to be with trusted adults and peers to fully develop all of what it means to be a human, not sitting in front of a screen. And look at this, the Netherlands and Finland just announced that they are removing technology. They know they got sold a bill of goods, and now it's become a huge distraction in the schools. And look at this, the New York Times, the journalist, did a 3-part series talking about, well, what do Silicon Valley executives do with their children? They send them to schools with no technology, not wired, not wireless, no technology. And they go so far as to have their nannies sign contracts that there will be no screens around their children. And you may know that Steve Jobs, who was one of the Apple founders, he never let his kids have tech. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells me we're grateful to our friends Patty and Doug Wood at Grassroots Environmental Education. They have that project, Americans for Responsible Technology, and they also launched Tech Safe Schools. So you can go out there and they will send a packet to your schools talking about not only the health risks, but the legal risk exposure, and most importantly, how to fix this. It's not rocket science, folks. We just need to get back into the habit of accessing the internet through hardwired connections with the antennas turned off, and then measure to make sure you got them all. So they've got a great set of resources for you here. The Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition recognizes that this radio frequency radiation is a problem, along with other environmental toxins. So they have built K through 12 curriculum to address these environmental exposures. And they've already got modules for wireless tech and cell phones. So this is the, I think it's like a 45-minute presentation that Dr. McKnight and I did 4 times in the same day at her kids' schools for professional development on their health and wellness day. So we have incredible resources. And then there's our little course with wireless education, where literally we can train the entire school in about a half an hour online. So our friends at Environmental Health Trust, which also sued the FCC, they have a whole page of all these printable resources, from 1 or 2 page flyers to posters to little cards to postcards to multilingual postcards, all sorts of great things. Because you don't want to open this conversation with nothing in hand, because we've all been conditioned. As soon as you say there's something wrong with wireless, we've been pre-programmed to think, ooh, tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, right? That's the messaging we've gotten. So you can expect that. But when you have something in hand, then you can say, I know, it sounds wackadoo, but go take a look at this. And I've got little on my website at Massachusetts for Safe Technology, on our resources page, I've got a little 2-sided postcard you could send over to the printer and have that printed up. But Environmental Health Trust has a ton of stuff too. And they also helped Maryland become the first state-level child protection agency to recommend we hardwire our schools. And they now have a fact sheet that was just released this year. So incredible resources all over for us to learn and then share with our schools, and not expect that they're going to take the ball and run with it. We are responsible for our children, so we have to carry the ball the entire way down the field. They're busy. Their plates are already overflowing. They don't want to hear about this. So it's up to us to be gracious, professional, but persistent, and not let the ball drop. So for our schools, and then for our healthcare practitioners, they have no idea this is why they can't heal their patients. But look at these amazing resources. This year, the first medical school textbook came out, The Electromagnetic Fields of Wireless Communications, the Biological and Health Effects, and leading experts from all over the world contributed chapters to this. And then Physicians for Safe Technology, they built this for other healthcare practitioners to come learn. And as I mentioned, we have that EMF medical conference in my earlier slides where you can learn for free. But we've got amazing resources for all the professions. So feel free to dig around in there. And then for your own work, your own home, some of us are do-it-yourselfers. Some of us just get terrified at the thought of figuring out cables and adapters. So there is a full, highly trained, credentialed profession called building biologists, and they can come into your home with all their measurement devices and measure your radio frequency exposures. Many of them are also trained to do the whole indoor environment, the VOCs, the formaldehyde, the mold, all the environmental pollutants that we get trapped indoors with. So just know there is help at every turn. And then this award-winning film, Generation Zapped, might be one of the first things you want to do. It took Best Documentary at the DC Independent Film Festival, at the Women's Independent Film Festival, and it was part of the United Nations Association Film Festival. In 74 minutes, you can watch this film with your loved ones, with the parents of the kids your kids hang out with the grandparents, because we know they're very concerned about this. They recognize the Big Tobacco Playbook when they see it. But watch this film together. Generation Zapped is now available on Amazon Prime, and it's also available through Canopy and Hoopla, which are streaming services that many of our libraries have today. So however you need to get it, it's there. And then you're not on the hook to be the bad guy. When everybody watches this, you level set and then send them my way, and they can come learn along with us. We have people who come back time and again and learn a little bit, do a little bit, learn a little bit, do a little bit more. So we're here to help you learn. But that film is a great way to open the conversation. And who knew Bert Wolf, who does his travel show on PBS, he got with a couple of the experts and they did 2 episodes on PBS. That's almost mainstream. And then here's that toolkit with Americans for Responsible Technology. They've got everything you need there. They cull the best practices. They cobbled together a local zoning bylaw that your town could start with. They also have a checklist. What does your local zoning say? Are you protected in your residential areas? And they have a lot of great resources there for you to help. And they'll give you real examples of towns that have already done it. So it can be done. You're going to have to educate the heck out of your town, though, because they've only been told by industry, we'll sue you if you don't let us approve this application. But there are legal ways we can stop that from happening in our towns. So we know we are in a crisis situation with social and emotional health, mental health in our countries today, all of our technologically advanced countries. So we have to learn to be the example. Our kids watch everything we do, and they are huge fans of monkey see, monkey do. Whatever we're doing, guess what? We give them permission to do. So start noticing what you're doing and model good behavior. This is a great poster to remind us what to do when we finally set down our devices. And then some of you may know about grounding or earthing. That's when we talk about the 7.83 times a second, the earth pulses this healthy electron energy to help regulate our own biology. Dr. Laura Conover takes this through all 4 seasons. You know, I live in the Northeast. I can't be walking around barefoot half the year. How can I naturally ground? And she gives us some really good tips all throughout the year for that. And then once we get a hold of what we've got going on in our own living spaces, how do we do this at the community level? So we've got a ton of resources here. The goal is to get to as low as reasonably achievable with man-made radiation. And the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention already uses this ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable, for the ionizing radiation. Now we need to have it implemented for the non-ionizing radiation as well. And they say do three things. 1, spend as little time as you can around something that's radiating, so time. 2, create as much distance as you can from something that's radiating. And 3, if you can't get away from it, learn how to shield. And if you do choose the shielding path, bring in a professional, because there are some pitfalls there. If you don't do it right, you could harm yourself more. So we have resources for our municipal leaders at this link. But it's critically important that we differentiate between what the industry is telling us we want and what we truly need to have exceptionally good technology in our towns. And Reinventing Wires, the future of landlines and networks, is free and online, and it tells us how to get there. So again, always measure not against these bogus FCC limits, but against the biological effects. And we know what those numbers are. Safe Living Technologies has it written down for us here. So we know that this is like drinking water out of a fire hose, and we apologize, but it's too important not to help you connect the dots on this. So what are next steps? We can't kid ourselves. There is no safe level of man-made radiation in the scientific literature. Even the head of the National Institutes of Environmental Health has said so, and she needs to see us take it from grassroots, push it up through the states, and then hopefully somebody up at the federal level. She said, yeah, we have captured agencies, but there still are some really good people at the federal level. So we need to empower our state authorities. That will then empower our federal authorities. So education is the key, right? We're not going to make any changes until we really understand what's going on. So that's why we do these 2 free seminars every month. Keep coming back, invite new people, invite your loved ones, invite your schools, invite your town, invite your legislators. And we're delighted when they come because we get to help. And I can be brought in to your towns to do specific, presentations. And when we did this with some of these towns, they strengthened their zoning bylaws and they started putting protections in place. But please do everything you can to get information to our schools, because we only get one chance to grow a proper child, and we're leaving them in a very toxic environment. And then start where you are. What do you do for a living? What are your quarterly or annual conventions? They're always looking for public speakers, and that's my happy place. So feel free to reach out, and I would love nothing more than to come in. Where possible, I do ask for a speaker's fee because I walked away from my tech writing career and I'm supposed to be building our retirement for my husband and I. But I will never say no, but I will ask for a speaker's fee if that's a possibility. Locally, tech's here to stay. Let's embrace it, but let's do it safely. So we should have tech safety committees in all of our towns. We should make sure our towns understand the danger of these smart meters and at least insist upon an opt-out. And then start moving away from wireless to hardwiring our schools, our libraries, our town halls, our playing fields, and get your zoning bylaws up to speed. You know, here's that checklist to start with. And most of our attorneys in our towns are wonderful people, but they are no match for industry. So fortunately, there are attorneys who used to work for industry, realized what they were doing, switched teams, and now somebody like Andrew Campanelli can be hired to come in. And it's pretty short money, I think, for like $8,500. He'll look at your local zoning. He'll look at your state laws. He knows the federal laws inside and out. And then he will help you to rewrite your local zoning code so it's as strong as it can be today before the industry gets in there and starts destroying your town. So for today, control what you can. Just start noticing what's radiating around you. Start with baby steps. Don't beat yourself up. Don't, go down the guilt alley because you gave your kids wireless tech. Start with baby steps. Create a sleep sanctuary, because if we don't protect our sleep, we're never going to get ahead of this vicious cycle of harm. And then migrate to Ethernet cables and adapters. Keep all your personal devices in airplane mode. If you have an iPhone, put it in airplane mode, but you also have to look at Bluetooth and Wi-Fi on your device. If it says not connected, that's not good enough. It's still pulsing radiation to make a handshake with the router or the cell tower. You need to just hit that button one more time and say off on the Bluetooth, off on the Wi-Fi. And then take advantage of all these great flyers and stuff that you can just download and print out and take with you when you open this conversation. And know that we do this twice a month. You can go to New Hampshire for Safe Technology's Facebook page, or you can email them directly at newhampshireforsafetechnology@gmail.com. If you go to my website, I've got all sorts of resources out there at your fingertips, and you'll reach me at ma4safetech@gmail.com. So thank you, everybody. We know it's like drinking water from a fire hose, to steal a phrase from the first medical conference. But we can do this, but it takes all of us. There's nobody coming on a knight in shining armor. It's you and I. That's how change happens. So thank you for your time. Deb, thank you for staying with us throughout the presentation. And if there's anything in the chat, or if people would like to raise their hands with any questions, we'd love to field that right now.
We do have a question in the chat from Chris. If you do not use a 5G cell phone, are you still receiving high levels of 5G radiation just from the background levels of 5G? That's the first question. And the second one is, is there a reliable way to know where 5G is currently operating?
Okay, I'll take the second one first. There are some websites that are starting to gather 5G data installations. If you go out to Massachusetts for Safe Technology and hit our resources page, click on the 5G link, and I think it's like Ookla and some others.
Yes.
But they may not be up to date. So the most important thing is to call your local town, or if you're looking at moving somewhere, call the zoning or planning or town planner and ask them, what are they getting for applications? Where are the installations? And you may need to cobble that together yourself. And then as far as, are you out of harm's way if you don't have a 5G phone? Not really. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is those 5G phones are also using the 4G and the 3G antennas that are going out and searching for somebody who has a 5G antenna. So that's constantly being pulsed, and your own cell phone is doing that too, unless you keep it in airplane mode. Secondly, the industry indicated that for 5G millimeter waves, they're using beamforming technology, and that will take this massive amount of power with radiation and beamform it so it just goes and finds the 5G devices. But that beam is going to go through everything in its path to find that 5G connection. And it's also pulsating, you know, the pebble in the pond, the 3G and 4G signals to be able to find these devices and then beamform down to them. So what we also have learned is that those 5G antennas, we were told, would only radiate the millimeter waves when somebody came by with a 5G connected device. But Eric Windheim and Orem Miller and others from the Building Biology Institute are taking their equipment out into the communities, and they're picking up 5G signals without anybody having a 5G device on their team. So yeah, it's not good. Okay. Were there other questions?
No, that was it, other than reminding people that yes, we will send out a video and your slides with all the links so that people can do their own deep dive of information. Oh, wait, just a comment.
Okay. Oh, somebody was asking if we can turn it off in our cars. I love that question. You'd have to go check individually car by car. I knew a guy who had a pickup truck and he figured out how to get into the fuse box, and he just unplugged the fuse that had the Bluetooth or whatever was radiating in his car. I had a car that you couldn't, so I got rid of it, and I found like an older model, single owner Lexus from 2002, and that's what I drive before they started putting all these sensors in the car. So Dr. Magda Havas, if you join her global EMF monitoring project, one of the projects that she's had us do, in addition to measuring our towns, she's having us measure our vehicles and give her that data so that we can then, or she can then go to the manufacturers and say, hey, there are people who would like to have a low EMF vehicle and at least have the option to turn off what's in there. So at every angle, we're trying to work a solution through, but it really requires us to help our scientists, to help our doctors learn about this, to help them get the training, to help our schools know how to do this right, and to help our towns take advantage of the many resources that are out there. All right.
There are no other comments. I did have one quick thing to add. It's kind of a fun thing. I noticed on HGTV the other day, House Hunters, a doctor and a nurse in the Pacific Northwest searching for a home. And the doctor's criteria was not how many bedrooms, how many garages. His only criteria was a low wireless zone. I was amazed because health was the most important thing to him. And I was like, what?
And that was on a mainstream media channel.
It was HGTV. I thought, wow.
Yeah. So I was just traveling to a conference and I got back, and I try to stay unplugged when I'm traveling. So of course I've got a gazillion emails to go through this week. But what I noticed is I put some ticklers set up. So when there's something in the media that talks about wireless radiation, I automatically get notified. You can set up those kind of notifications. And just as I scanned my emails really quick, I saw there were many more notifications coming through the media than I've seen lately. So maybe we're getting closer to a tipping point. Canadian teachers up in Toronto are banding together and saying, we're not coming back to school if you let that cell tower up, right? So lots of good things. And Deb is just so great. She posts things out at New Hampshire for Safe Technology and cross-posts them for us at Massachusetts for Safe Technology out on Facebook. When we hear about things in Massachusetts, I put them up at Massachusetts for Safe Technology on our news page. So please, everybody, come learn. You won't hear it through mainstream media as often as we'd like, but we're always here to answer questions if we can. So Deb, thanks for co-hosting, everybody. Thank you so much. And we look forward to next time. Have a tech safe day.
Thanks, Cece.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.